At 54, Maggie Sullivan walked into work expecting another ordinary Tuesday. Instead, she was called into a conference room, thanked for 30 years of loyalty, and told that her position had been eliminated. By lunchtime, the young woman replacing her, barely half her age, was already sitting at Maggie's desk, while co-workers avoided eye contact and whispered that it was simply the future. Some pitied her. Others quietly laughed at the idea that someone who had devoted her entire life to the telephone industry no longer had a place in it. With a cardboard box in her arms and no plan for tomorrow, Maggie believed her life had reached its lowest point. 3 days later, a lawyer handed her the keys to a forgotten telephone exchange left behind by her late great-aunt Clara, the only inheritance she would ever receive. Everyone in town said the old building was worthless, nothing more than a crumbling relic that should have been demolished decades ago. Maggie almost agreed, but while clearing dust from an abandoned operator's station, she noticed a loose floorboard beneath the switchboard. Hidden underneath was a locked steel cabinet no one seemed to know existed. Inside waited dozens of weathered diaries written by generations of telephone operators, and one volume that had mysteriously disappeared years before. What was written inside those diaries was so extraordinary that Clara had protected them for the rest of her life, and Maggie was about to discover why. But before we unlock that cabinet and turn the very first page, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below and say hello. I read as many of them as I can.
If you're new here and enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten American history, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people who changed lives in extraordinary ways, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel wherever you are in the world. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Now, let's go back to the Tuesday when Maggie Sullivan lost everything.
Without realizing she was only days away from finding the greatest purpose of her life. At 54, Maggie Sullivan still arrived 12 minutes early. Even on Tuesdays, no one remembered. She parked behind the regional office, balanced her coffee on the roof of her sedan, and checked her reflection before going inside. The building had changed around her for 30 years. New logos, new software, new managers with shorter memories, but the work remained familiar. Customers called frightened, angry, lonely, or confused, and Maggie listened until their voices softened. That morning, however, her access badge flashed red. She tried again. Red. Through the glass doors, a receptionist she had trained looked up, then quickly away. A security guard opened the door without smiling. "System update," he said. Maggie thanked him, though neither believed it. On the 4th floor, conversations stopped as she passed. Her team stared at their screens. At her desk sat a laptop beside a cardboard box. Before Maggie could touch either, her director, Paul Brennan, appeared. "Conference room 3, he said. Inside, a woman from Human Resources waited with a blue folder. Paul closed the door. She spoke first, using phrases Maggie had heard in training sessions but never expected to hear about herself: restructuring, efficiency, role consolidation, evolving customer needs. Maggie watched Paul rub his wedding ring with his thumb. "So my position is gone?" she asked. "The position as currently defined," he said, "but the work remains." The woman paused. "The responsibilities will transfer to a new customer experience lead." Through the glass wall, Maggie saw Grace Whitmore crossing the floor. 27, quick, capable, always carrying 2 phones. Maggie had spent 6 months teaching her how to calm callers without making promises the company could not keep. Grace noticed Maggie in the room. hesitated, then kept walking. "You hired my replacement before telling me," Maggie said. Paul sighed. "This isn't personal." The sentence hurt more than anger would have. 30 years of holidays, late shifts, storm outages, and missed dinners had been compressed into something too impersonal to regret. They offered 12 weeks of severance, temporary health coverage, and online career workshops. Maggie signed where they pointed because her hands needed something to do. When she returned to her desk, the cardboard box had been opened. No one spoke. She placed inside a framed service award, 2 pens, a ceramic mug shaped like an old rotary phone, and a photograph of the team from before half of them had been replaced. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered behind her. Maggie turned. The younger woman looked frightened rather than victorious. "Did you know?" Maggie asked. Grace swallowed. "Not until yesterday." Maggie wanted to blame her. It would have been easier. Instead, she nodded once and lifted the box. "Near the elevators," someone muttered. "That's how it goes now," followed by a nervous laugh. Maggie kept walking. In the parking lot, she set the box on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Her phone showed a bank alert reminding her rent was due Friday. She calculated what the severance might cover, then stopped when the numbers began to feel like walls closing in. At home, the apartment greeted her with the hum of the refrigerator. She placed the box on the kitchen table, reheated soup, and opened her laptop to update a resume she had not touched since 1998. Every sentence sounded like an apology for being old. By 7, she had deleted more than she had written. She called no one. Her parents were gone. Her marriage had ended years earlier, and the few friends she still saw were busy with grandchildren and lives that had continued in the expected direction. Maggie stood at the window and watched office lights blink on across the street. For the first time since she was 24, no one expected her anywhere the next morning. The thought should have felt like freedom. It felt like erasure. At 8:12, her phone rang. She almost ignored it. "Margaret Sullivan," a man asked. "This is Edward Hale, attorney for the estate of Clara Sullivan." Maggie sat down. Great-aunt Clara had died 2 months earlier in a nursing home 3 counties away. They had exchanged Christmas cards and occasional calls, but Maggie had not seen her in years. "There isn't much money," the lawyer continued, "but she named you sole beneficiary of a property in Bellwether." Maggie pictured Clara's house. The house? No, that was sold for her care. "The property is the former Bellwether Independent Telephone Exchange." Maggie frowned. She remembered a brick building beyond the old courthouse, its windows boarded, its sign barely readable. That place is still standing? Barely. There are unpaid taxes and repair concerns. You may refuse the inheritance. He cleared his throat. "However, Miss Sullivan left instructions that I deliver a key and sealed note before you decide." The next afternoon, Maggie sat across from him in a law office while rain tapped the windows. He pushed a brass key across the desk, then a yellowed envelope with her name written in Clara's hand. Maggie broke the seal. Inside was one sentence. "Don't sell this place until you've heard every voice." The drive to Bellwether took just under 2 hours, though Maggie stopped twice before reaching the town square. Once for gas, once because she caught herself wondering whether refusing the inheritance might still be the wiser choice. A vacant commercial building with unpaid taxes was hardly the fresh start anyone imagined. Yet Clara's note remained folded inside her purse, its single sentence refusing to leave her thoughts. "Don't sell this place until you've heard every voice." By late morning, she turned onto Main Street, where brick storefronts lined both sides of the road, beneath faded signs that hinted at busier decades. The courthouse clock still overlooked the square. Across from it stood the telephone exchange. Time had not been kind to it. Ivy climbed the red brick walls. Several windows were covered with weathered plywood. The painted words "Bellwether Independent Telephone Exchange" had nearly disappeared beneath years of sun and rain. The building looked forgotten, but not abandoned in the careless way empty places often did. Someone had occasionally swept the front steps. Fresh flowers, now beginning to wilt, rested beside the entrance. Maggie unlocked the heavy wooden door with Clara's brass key. The hinges groaned before giving way. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight that slipped between cracked shutters. The air carried the scent of old paper, polished wood, and something electrical that had long since fallen silent. She stood still, allowing her eyes to adjust. The lobby remained almost exactly as she remembered from childhood visits with Clara decades earlier. A long oak counter separated visitors from the operator's room beyond. Brass directory plates still hung neatly on the wall. Behind the counter stretched a large switchboard covered with rows of faded cords, plugs, and tiny signal lamps. Every operator's chair remained tucked carefully beneath its station, as though the women who had worked there had simply stepped outside for lunch. Maggie reached out and rested her fingers on the polished wood. Dust coated her hand, yet beneath it, the surface remained smooth from thousands of hours of work. She quietly imagined operators connecting neighbors, doctors, firefighters, worried parents, and children calling home before supper. It was impossible not to feel that countless ordinary lives had once passed through this silent room. Her phone vibrated. It was Edward Hale checking whether she had reached the property. Before ending the call, he mentioned someone had volunteered to help if she needed a building inspection. 20 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled beside the exchange. The driver climbed out carrying a clipboard and camera. "Margaret Sullivan?" he asked with an easy smile. "Daniel Price." They shook hands. Daniel explained that he restored historic buildings and occasionally advised the town on preservation projects. "Most people only see another old structure," he said while studying the brickwork. "I see one of the last independent exchanges left standing in this part of the state." Maggie admitted she knew almost nothing about maintaining historic buildings. Daniel walked slowly through each room, making notes about roof repairs, leaking pipes, aging electrical wiring, and cracked plaster. The list grew longer with every doorway. Maggie sighed. "Sounds expensive." "Eventually," Daniel answered honestly. "But the bones are solid. Whoever cared for this place respected it." As they entered the operator's room again, Daniel paused. "I've seen museums with less original equipment than this." The switchboards, clocks, handwritten routing charts, and wooden cabinets had all been left exactly where they belonged. Nothing appeared stripped or vandalized. It felt less like an abandoned building than a room waiting for someone to unlock it again. While Daniel measured one wall, the front door opened softly. An elderly woman stepped inside carrying a small basket. She moved carefully with a cane, but held herself with quiet confidence. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. She stopped the moment she saw the switchboard. Tears filled her eyes before she spoke. "I wondered who finally opened the doors." Maggie introduced herself. The woman smiled gently. "Then you're Clara's niece?" "Great-niece," Maggie corrected. "I'm Eleanor Brooks." She reached out and lightly touched one of the operator chairs. "I spent 43 years sitting right here." Maggie recognized the name from old Christmas cards Clara occasionally mentioned. Eleanor had been chief operator before retirement. She slowly walked along the switchboard, brushing invisible dust from familiar places. "Every morning, Clara unlocked this room before anyone else arrived," she said. "She believed the exchange deserved to wake up before the town did." Maggie unfolded Clara's note from her purse. "She left me this. I don't understand what she meant." Eleanor read the sentence without taking the paper. Her expression softened, but she shook her head. "She knew you'd ask. Can you explain it?" Eleanor looked around the silent room. "No." Maggie frowned. "Why not?" "Because some things belong to the building first." She rested one hand on the switchboard. "The building still remembers." Before Maggie could ask another question, Eleanor quietly wished her well and left as gently as she had arrived. Daniel watched through the window until the older woman disappeared down the sidewalk. "Interesting answer," he said. Maggie nodded, unsettled. She wandered back toward the operator stations, replaying Eleanor's words, "The building still remembers." While wiping dust from Clara's former desk, her cloth snagged against a narrow seam beneath the wooden base. Kneeling, Maggie noticed a small, recessed handle almost hidden by decades of grime. She pulled. A shallow panel slid open, revealing a heavy steel cabinet fitted neatly beneath the desk. Its lock had escaped notice entirely. Daniel crouched beside her. "That wasn't on any floor plan I've ever seen." Maggie inserted Clara's brass key into the cabinet. It turned with surprising ease. Inside, stacked with remarkable care, rested dozens of worn leather diaries, each labeled with a handwritten year and carefully numbered in sequence. Maggie lifted the first diary from the cabinet with both hands. Its brown leather cover had softened at the corners, and the number 1 had been written in fading black ink beneath the year 1938. Daniel carried 2 chairs beside the switchboard while Maggie opened it carefully. The first page contained no private conversations, only a sentence signed by the chief operator. "We record what happened because people will remember the call, but forget the woman who answered." Maggie read it twice. The entries that followed were brief, written by different hands. One described an operator recognizing panic in a farmer's voice after he requested the doctor but gave the wrong address. She kept him talking, determined his location from nearby train whistles, and sent help before he collapsed. Another told of a child who called the exchange after wandering away from home during a county fair. The operator connected every shop along Main Street until someone found him crying beside the bakery. "These are incident records," Daniel said. "Not exactly." Maggie turned another page. The operator had added details no official report would contain. The farmer's embarrassment when he thanked her. The child refusing to release her hand. The mother bringing peach preserves to the exchange every summer afterward. They wrote down what the calls meant. Maggie said, a later diary described a winter night when an elderly widower repeatedly asked for a number that had been disconnected after his wife died. Instead of correcting him, an operator remained on the line until dawn, listening as he spoke about 42 years of marriage. At the end of the entry, she had written, "Sometimes connecting a person means not transferring the call." Maggie closed the book for a moment. She remembered the customers who had called her office for reasons that barely involved telephone service. A man disputing a bill who finally admitted his wife had died. A frightened woman who kept asking about static because she needed another human voice. Maggie had always believed those conversations disappeared when the line went quiet. Seeing similar moments preserved made her chest tighten. Daniel noticed. "Are you all right?" "I spent 30 years being told calls should be shorter." She ran her thumb along the diary's edge. These women measured success differently. They continued through the morning.
Diary 3 contained the story of a 16-year-old girl who called without speaking. The operator heard only breathing and the faint creak of a porch swing. She recognized the sound from a house on Willow Road, contacted the girl's aunt through another line,
and kept the connection open until help arrived. The entry never stated what the girl had intended to do, only that she lived, later married, and sent an unsigned Christmas card to the exchange every year. Diary 5 recorded the night floodwater cut off the eastern farms. Operators remained at their stations despite rising water in the basement, relaying messages between families and volunteer rescuers until the final household was reached. No names in the newspaper article. Daniel said after searching an old clipping on his phone, it credits the sheriff's office. Maggie looked at the neat handwriting. The operators didn't seem to expect credit. Around noon, Eleanor returned with a thermos and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She did not appear surprised to find the diaries open. "Clara hoped you would start with the beginning," she said. Maggie offered her a chair. "Why did they keep these?" Eleanor poured coffee into 3 paper cups. "Because official records count calls, outages, and minutes. They don't count fear. They don't count patience. They don't record the moment someone decides to keep living because another person stayed on the line." Maggie glanced toward the cabinet. Were operators allowed to document calls? They never copied private words. That mattered to Clara. They recorded actions, consequences, and what the town learned. Eleanor tapped one diary gently. "We knew almost everyone by voice. We knew who lived alone, who had a sick child, whose husband worked nights, who could reach the doctor fastest. That knowledge carried responsibility." She told Maggie how operators practiced remaining calm during fires and storms. They memorized roads, family connections, and emergency numbers. Sometimes they connected calls. Sometimes they sent help before callers understood they needed it. "People think we listened for gossip," Eleanor said. "Mostly we listened for danger." Maggie asked whether Clara had written entries. Eleanor nodded. "For many years." "Then why didn't she tell me any of this?" Eleanor looked toward the silent switchboard. Clara believed stories given too easily are rarely valued. After lunch, Eleanor left them to continue reading. Maggie arranged the diaries in numerical order across the oak counter. Some covered 1 year, others several. The handwriting changed with each generation, but the purpose remained consistent. One question was answered repeatedly. The operators had not been passive witnesses. They had been an unofficial emergency network, counseling service, and source of human connection long before such services existed locally. Yet each answer created another question. Why had Clara hidden the diaries instead of donating them? Why preserve them inside a locked cabinet where no one could read them? Maggie reached Diary 9 and found an entry about a missing boy during a thunderstorm. The operator remembered he feared church bells and called every home near St. Matthew's until a woman reported seeing him shelter beneath the bell tower stairs. The final sentence read, "We found him because someone remembered what frightened him." Maggie thought of her former office, where customer histories had been reduced to account numbers and automated notes. She had once known which callers needed extra time. The company had called that inefficiency. Here, it had saved lives. Daniel began returning the diaries to the cabinet, while Maggie checked the numbering. 1 through 11, she said, touching each spine. Then 13. Daniel stopped. Together they counted again. The sequence was complete except for one gap. Eleanor had said the diaries were protected carefully, and the shelves showed no unused space where a volume might have been misplaced. Maggie searched beneath the other books, then examined the rear of the cabinet. Nothing. On the inside cover of Diary 13, someone had written a single line in Clara's hand. The record continues, though one voice has been removed. Maggie stared at the empty place between the volumes. Diary number 12 was missing. The missing space between Diary 11 and Diary 13 seemed larger the next morning. Maggie stood behind the oak counter with a legal pad, copying every date from the cabinet while Daniel photographed the spines. Diary 11 ended in December 1956. Diary 13 began in March 1958. More than a year of the exchange's history had vanished. If Clara removed it, she left a trail. Maggie said, Daniel glanced at the sentence inside Diary 13. Or a warning. They began at the Bellwether Public Library, where local newspapers had been transferred to microfilm. The machine clicked and hummed as Maggie searched month by month. Most articles were ordinary school concerts, council meetings, store openings, farm auctions. Then a January 1957 headline stopped her. Ice storm Seavers County lines. The article praised road crews, deputies, and volunteers who carried supplies to isolated families. The telephone exchange appeared only once, in a final paragraph noting that service had been intermittently restored. No operators were named. Maggie printed the page. Daniel found another article from 3 weeks later about a fundraising supper for storm victims. A photograph showed 6 women standing outside the exchange. Eleanor was too young to be among them, but Maggie recognized Clara near the edge, half turned away from the camera. The caption listed 5 names. Clara's was not one of them. Maybe the paper made a mistake. Daniel said, Maggie studied the image. Or someone wanted her left out. They searched employee announcements and civic records. One name appeared repeatedly before the storm and then disappeared. Rose Mercer, night operator. Rose had won a church baking contest, volunteered at the school clinic, and attended the telephone workers' picnic in 1956. After January 1957, there was nothing. No wedding notice, obituary, departure announcement, or mention of another job. Maggie wrote the name beneath Diary 12 on her pad. At the exchange. Eleanor was waiting in the lobby. She looked at the printed storm article and immediately tightened her grip on her cane. You found that quickly, she said. Who was Rose Mercer? Maggie asked. Eleanor lowered herself into an operator's chair. One of the best listeners this town ever had. Why does she vanish from the records? Eleanor's gaze moved toward the dark signal lamps. Because Bellwether preferred remembering the rescue, not the fear that came before it. She explained that the ice storm had arrived overnight, bringing down poles and closing roads. Families outside town lost heat. A school bus carrying children from a late rehearsal became stranded near the eastern ridge. Operators worked while lines failed one by one, patching weak connections through any route that remained. Was Rose here? Daniel asked. All night. Eleanor's voice softened. So was Clara. Maggie waited, but Eleanor folded the article and placed it on the desk. There are parts I promised Clara I would not tell before the building did. People could have died. Maggie said, People almost did. Eleanor stood with visible effort. That winter changed who was praised and who was blamed. The diary explained why. Without it, I can only give you another person's conclusion. Before leaving, she touched Maggie's shoulder. Look where voices traveled, not where people sat. The words led them to the basement. Daniel found the door behind a storage cabinet, swollen shut from damp. Together they shifted the cabinet, pried the door open, and descended narrow concrete steps. The air smelled of rust and wet stone. Rows of dead batteries lined one wall. Thick cables entered through clay conduits and disappeared beneath the floor. Daniel's flashlight revealed a passage behind the equipment racks. "Maintenance access," he said. Old exchanges used tunnels to reach cable junctions without tearing up the street. The tunnel was low enough that Maggie had to duck. Water dripped steadily from overhead pipes. After 20 feet, they reached a fork. One branch ended at a bricked wall. The other ran beneath the operator's room. Marks scratched into the plaster showed dates and initials from repair crews. Maggie found Clara's initials beside 1957. Below them, an arrow pointed upward. Directly overhead, a metal hatch opened into the base of the switchboard. Daniel pushed it carefully, and a narrow section of wooden paneling lifted above them. "Concealed access," he said. "Back upstairs." They removed the panel and discovered a compartment behind the routing boards. It held brittle maintenance sheets, spare fuses, and envelopes containing line diagrams. Maggie searched each one. No diary. Her disappointment sharpened into frustration. Clara had preserved everything, yet every clue seemed designed to stop short of an answer. Daniel unfolded a large diagram across the counter. "This isn't only wiring." Faded red pencil formed a second set of lines over the printed cable routes. They began at the switchboard, passed through the basement tunnel, and continued beyond the exchange's rear wall. Beside several intersections were handwritten symbols: a bell, a cross, a schoolhouse, and a circle around an unlabeled square. Maggie compared the handwriting to Clara's note. The slanted capital letters matched. Taped to the back was a smaller sheet, yellow with age. It showed the exchange footprint and a narrow route leading beneath the building to a room not included on the official plan. At the bottom, Clara had written, "What was carried through the lines was kept where the lines could not reach." Daniel turned the map toward the rear of the room. The marked route ended beneath a sealed section of floor behind the final operator station. Maggie followed it with her finger until she reached a black X underneath. In Clara's hand were 3 words: "Begin below here." Daniel knelt behind the final operator station and tapped the floorboards with the handle of his screwdriver. The first 3 gave back a dull, solid sound. The 4th answered with a hollow knock. Maggie held the map beside Clara's handwritten X while Daniel worked a narrow pry bar into the seam. The board resisted, then lifted with a dry crack that released decades of dust. Beneath it lay a square iron ring set into a wooden hatch. "This was built to disappear," Daniel said. Together they pulled it open. A short ladder descended into darkness. The space below was not part of the maintenance tunnel they had already explored. It was narrower, cleaner, and lined with shelves protected behind glass-fronted cabinets. A single metal desk stood against the far wall. On it rested a green-shaded lamp, a wooden file box, and a framed photograph of 12 telephone operators gathered beneath the exchange sign. Clara stood in the center. Rose Mercer was beside her. Maggie climbed down carefully, followed by Daniel. The room smelled of cedar, paper, and dry stone. Unlike the damp tunnel, it had been sealed against moisture. Clara's archive. Maggie whispered. Each cabinet was labeled in her hand: property, operators, correspondence, offers, incidents. Daniel opened the nearest drawer and found building permits, tax receipts, repair invoices, and photographs documenting every change made to the exchange. Maggie chose the drawer marked Offers. Inside were letters from developers, utility companies, and one regional chain that had wanted the corner for a parking structure. The earliest offer dated back more than 30 years. The amounts increased over time.
One company had offered enough money to make Clara comfortable for the rest of her life. Her replies were clipped to each proposal. The wording changed, but the answer never did. The exchange was not for sale. One developer had written again, calling the building obsolete and warning that sentiment would not pay for repairs. Clara's response contained only 2 sentences. Obsolescence is not the same as worthlessness. Some structures hold what a town has forgotten how to carry. Maggie read the lines aloud. Daniel leaned against the desk. She knew exactly what she was protecting. Then why hide it all? Maggie asked. Maybe because people kept trying to put a price on it. In the operator's cabinet, Maggie found employment cards, group photographs, condolence notices, and sealed envelopes organized by year. Beneath them lay a ledger titled Chief Operator's Transfer Record. The first entry was dated 1938. Each chief operator had signed when responsibility for the diaries passed to her. The signatures continued across decades. Beatrice Hall, Ruth Coleman, Rose Mercer, Eleanor Brooks, and finally, Clara Sullivan. Beside every name was a short promise. I will preserve what was witnessed, protect what was entrusted, and add only what serves the truth. Maggie traced Clara's signature. It was dated 3 years before the exchange closed. Eleanor said every chief operator added to the diaries. She said, "This proves it." Daniel turned the next page. Clara had added a final note. The keeper is not the owner. She is only the person who refuses to let silence become erasure. Maggie thought about the cardboard box still sitting on her kitchen table. For days, she had believed losing her job meant everything she had done there had vanished. No plaque, no farewell, no one willing to look at her as she left. Yet these women had worked without public recognition and still believed their care mattered enough to preserve. The thought did not remove the hurt, but it changed its shape. Above them, the front door opened. Daniel climbed out first. Maggie followed and found Grace Whitmore standing in the operator's room, holding Maggie's ceramic rotary phone mug in both hands. She looked younger outside the office, without the company badge and polished confidence. "I'm sorry to come without calling," Grace said. "Mr. Hale gave me the address after I explained who I was." Maggie's body tightened before she could stop it. "Why are you here?" Grace held out the mug. "This was left in a drawer beneath your desk." Maggie took it but said nothing. Grace glanced at the switchboards. "I also wanted to apologize properly. What happened was wrong. You already apologized. I said I was sorry because I was scared. That isn't the same thing." Her fingers twisted around the strap of her bag. "They told me I was taking a redesigned position. They didn't tell me they were removing you until the day before. Then they asked me to prepare a transition memo using procedures you wrote." Maggie looked away. The anger she had tried not to feel returned. But it no longer pointed only at Grace. "Did you accept?" "Yes," Grace said. "I needed the job, and part of me was proud." "I hate admitting that." The honesty surprised Maggie. Grace continued. "Yesterday a caller asked for you, an older man whose wife died. He said you always let him finish explaining before transferring him. I didn't know what to say." Maggie ran her thumb over the mug's chipped handle. "You listen," she said, "even when the timer tells you to move on." Grace nodded, eyes bright. "You taught me that." For the first time. Maggie saw not the person sitting at her desk, but a young woman inside a system that had decided experience and efficiency could not exist together. Forgiving her did not excuse what the company had done. It simply released Grace from carrying all of it. "None of this was your decision,"
Maggie said. Grace let out a breath. I still benefited from it. Then do the work well. Maggie looked toward the diaries, and remember the people on the other end are more than calls. Grace promised she would. Before leaving, she asked if the exchange might someday open to visitors. Maggie answered that she did not know yet, but the question stayed with her. Back below, Maggie returned to the archive with steadier hands. In the correspondence cabinet,
She found a packet addressed to the next keeper. Inside were several letters from Clara, each tied to a specific part of the collection. One explained why the diaries had been separated from the archive. Another warned that names should never be exposed merely to satisfy curiosity. The final letter was sealed with red wax. Maggie broke it carefully. Clara's handwriting had weakened, but the message was clear. If you have reached this room, you now understand that the diaries were never complete without the final record. It contains the truth of what we chose, what we lost, and why the exchange survived. Do not judge any of us until you have read it. Maggie searched the desk, every drawer, and all 5 cabinets. Daniel checked behind the shelves and beneath the file boxes. They found references to the final diary in 3 separate inventories, each listing it as the last volume in the collection. But there was no final diary in Clara's archive, no empty space marked for it, and no note saying where it had gone. Maggie read the inventory one more time. The last line had been underlined twice. Final record to remain with the last operator. The diary that was supposed to explain everything was missing. Eleanor chose the operator's room to tell the story, insisting that some truths sounded different beneath the switchboard lamps. Rain pressed softly against the boarded windows, while Maggie and Daniel sat across from her at the oak counter. Eleanor placed both hands over the head of her cane and looked toward the chair where Clara had once worked. The winter emergency wasn't only about broken lines, she began. It was about a choice no one wanted attached to their name. During the 1957 ice storm, the county's main circuits failed before midnight. The school bus stranded near the eastern ridge carried 11 children and their music teacher. At the same time, a farmhouse beyond Mill Creek reported a pregnant woman in labor, and an elderly couple on Quarry Road lost heat after a tree crushed their chimney. Only one unstable trunk line remained. It could not hold every connection. Rose Mercer was chief night operator, but Clara had reached the exchange first and began routing calls before Rose arrived. The sheriff wanted the line reserved for official traffic. Eleanor said, he ordered Clara to disconnect private callers. Clara refused. She knew the Eastern Ridge roads better than the deputies and understood that the children could not be reached unless local families relayed their location from house to house. She kept the civilian lines open long enough to form a chain of voices across the county. Each household passed information to the next until a farmer with a snow tractor found the bus. Then why was anyone blamed? Maggie asked. Eleanor's expression tightened. Because while Clara protected the relay, the courthouse lost contact with the state emergency office for 17 minutes. Officials later claimed the delay endangered the entire county. Rose arrived during those 17 minutes and signed the operating log as chief. When questions began, the town assumed Rose had ignored the sheriff's order. Clara tried to correct them. Eleanor said, Rose wouldn't allow it. Rose believed Clara's family would lose the exchange if the county accused its owner of obstructing emergency communications. She accepted responsibility, resigned, and left Bellwether before spring. The children survived. The woman at Mill Creek delivered safely after operators located a retired nurse nearby. The elderly couple were brought into town.
Yet Rose became the careless operator who had tied up an emergency line. While the official story praised the men who completed the rescues, Maggie thought of Rose disappearing from every public record after the storm. Clara let her take the blame, at first, Eleanor said, and that became the regret she carried for the rest of her life. Clara had promised Rose she would reveal the truth once the exchange was financially secure. But months became years. Rose built another life elsewhere and asked that her name remain buried. She feared that reopening the scandal would harm the families they had protected and expose private details about the callers. Clara honored that request, though it cost her peace. That's why the story was never written down, Maggie said. Eleanor nodded. Not in full. Diary 12 contained the operating sequence and the decisions made that night. But not Rose's sacrifice. Clara believed writing everything would betray her. Later, when Rose died, Clara no longer knew whether silence protected her or erased her. Daniel leaned forward. So the missing diary could prove the rescue depended on the operators. It could prove more than that, Eleanor replied. It could show that the county's official account was incomplete. Maggie felt anger rise, then soften into something heavier. Clara had not hidden a scandal for profit. She had been trapped between truth and a promise. The operators had protected people by knowing when to speak, but sometimes their silence had consequences. Maggie glanced at the rows of diaries. Why tell me now? Eleanor looked directly at her. Because Clara chose you to decide what listening requires, after the person who asked for silence is gone. The question followed Maggie through the next several days. She and Daniel reviewed the archived letters again, searching for any reference to Rose's departure or the missing record. Evidence continued pointing toward Diary 12, but its location remained unknown. Meanwhile, the exchange demanded practical attention. A leak spread across the rear ceiling. 2 window frames had rotted through, and the town issued a notice requiring the front steps to be repaired. Maggie expected the mounting costs to weaken her resolve. Instead, people began arriving. An elderly man brought lumber left from rebuilding his porch. A retired electrician offered to inspect the old wiring. 3 former telephone employees came with cleaning supplies and spent an afternoon wiping dust from the switchboards. Each had heard that Maggie was preserving the operator's stories. None asked what the property might become. They simply said the building should not be lost. Mayor Helen Dawson visited on the 4th morning, wearing work shoes instead of the formal heels Maggie had seen in newspaper photographs. She studied Daniel's repair estimates and walked through the archive without touching anything. The council considered this building a liability, she admitted. Clara refused every discussion about demolition. She had reasons, Maggie said. I'm beginning to understand that. Maggie showed her copies of the storm article, the unnamed photograph, and the chief operator's transfer ledger. She did not reveal private details from Eleanor's account, only that the exchange held verifiable records missing from Bellwether's official history. Mayor Dawson read in silence. If these materials can be preserved responsibly, she said, the town may be able to help with emergency stabilization and a historical designation application. It was not a promise, but it was the first institutional support Maggie had received. Why change your mind? Maggie asked. The mayor looked toward the volunteers repairing the steps. Because a nuisance doesn't usually inspire this many people to bring their own tools. By the end of the week, the exchange no longer looked entirely abandoned. Light entered through cleaned windows. The lobby floor emerged beneath the grime. One switchboard station had been polished until the brass fittings reflected the room. Maggie stood beside Daniel as volunteers carried broken plaster outside. "Clara kept it standing," he said. "You're giving people a reason to enter." Maggie was about to answer when a sharp, metallic click came from the final operator station. One of the volunteers had pulled an old connecting cord, causing a narrow brass panel to spring loose beneath the switchboard. Maggie crossed the room and removed the panel carefully. Inside was a small hidden compartment, shallow and lined with felt. It contained no diary, only a cream-colored envelope darkened around the edges. Her name was written across the front in Clara's unmistakable hand. Below it were 6 words: "For Maggie, when Rose has been heard." The cream-colored envelope remained on the oak counter until the last volunteer had gone, and Daniel had locked the front door. Eleanor sat at the final operator station, her cane resting against one knee, while Maggie held the envelope beneath the restored pendant light. Clara's handwriting across the front read, "For Maggie, when Rose has been heard." Maggie opened it carefully. Inside was a small brass key and a single sheet of paper. Clara had written only a few lines. "Rose must never be remembered as a woman who disappeared in shame. She chose silence to protect the people whose lives passed through our lines. Once you understand that, the missing record may be read without becoming a weapon. The key belongs to the last position." Maggie looked toward the switchboard. The last position Eleanor pointed to Clara's former station. She worked there after the exchange stopped taking public calls. Sometimes she sat for hours without connecting a single line. Daniel examined the wooden panels beneath the signal lamps. Behind a tarnished brass plate, he found a keyhole no wider than a matchstick. The key turned with a soft click. A narrow drawer slid from inside the switchboard. Resting within it was a worn leather volume marked 12. Maggie lifted the diary with both hands. The cover was more faded than the others, its edges darkened by years of handling. Eleanor touched it once, then withdrew her hand. "Clara read that book every winter," she said. "She never decided whether hiding it was loyalty or cowardice." Maggie opened to the first page. Rose Mercer's handwriting was neat and deliberate. The early entries described routine work in January 1957, freezing rain forecasts, weak rural circuits, families requesting extra checks on elderly neighbors. As the storm approached, the writing grew tighter. Operators packed blankets and food because roads might close before their shifts ended. Clara tested emergency routes. Rose listed farms with private generators and homes where nurses, mechanics, or volunteer drivers could be reached. They had prepared not merely to connect calls, Maggie realized, but to understand what each voice could contribute. The night of the storm began with fallen branches and scattered outages. Then the county's main lines failed. Rose recorded each surviving circuit, every rerouted connection, and the exact minute the stranded school bus was reported missing near the eastern ridge. The sheriff ordered the last stable trunk line reserved for official communication. Clara refused to disconnect the neighborhood relay already forming across rural homes. Families passed the bus's last known location from one weak line to another. A farmer heard the message and offered his snow tractor. Another caller described a fence damaged near the Ridge Road. A woman near St. Matthew's reported hearing children shouting through the wind. Piece by piece, the operators narrowed the search. Daniel leaned over Maggie's shoulder as she read. "The official crews didn't locate the bus first," he said. "The callers did. The operators connected what everyone knew," Maggie replied. The diary showed that while the search continued, another call arrived from Mill Creek. A woman had gone into labor while roads were blocked. Rose located a retired nurse living nearby and guided 2 neighbors in reaching the farmhouse on foot. Minutes later, An elderly couple on Quarry Road lost heat when part of their chimney collapsed. Clara persuaded a grocer with a delivery truck to bring them into town before the road became impassable. None of those actions appeared in the newspaper account. Yet everyone depended on the operators knowing voices, families, distances, and who could be trusted in an emergency. The final storm entry ended shortly before dawn. The children were safe. The mother at Mill Creek had delivered a healthy daughter. The couple from Quarry Road was sleeping in the church basement. Rose wrote, "The town survived because no voice was treated as too ordinary to matter." The entries after the storm were harder to read. County officials questioned why the courthouse had lost access to the trunk line for 17 minutes. Rose had signed the operating log as chief operator, though Clara had made the decision to preserve the civilian relay. Rumors spread that Rose had ignored emergency protocol. She recorded Clara's attempt to confess publicly and her own refusal to permit it. "If the county blames the owner," Rose had written, "they may close the exchange. If they blame an operator who resigns, the lines remain for everyone." Rose left Bellwether before spring. She asked Clara not to reveal the private emergencies carried through the relay system. Clearing her name would have required identifying families at their most vulnerable: a frightened mother, stranded children, elderly residents unable to protect themselves. Rose believed their dignity mattered more than her reputation. Maggie closed the diary halfway and looked at Eleanor. She gave up her name to protect theirs. Eleanor nodded. And Clara preserved the exchange because of what Rose gave up. The remaining pages contained no scandal and no accusation. They documented Clara's efforts to contact Rose over the years. Rose's repeated insistence that the matter remain private, and finally, a notice of Rose's death sent by a distant cousin. Clara added one final entry decades later. She wrote that the diary had been hidden because truth without compassion could become another form of harm. Anyone reading Volume 12 first might search for blame, expose families, or turn sacrifice into entertainment. The earlier diaries taught the reader how the operators measured responsibility. Only then could Rose's choice be understood. Maggie returned the volume to the counter beside the others. The gap in the numbered sequence was finally closed. "The diaries were never gossip," she said. "They were instructions about how to remember people without betraying them." Over the following days, that principle guided every decision. Maggie and Daniel cataloged the collection while keeping sensitive names out of public summaries. Eleanor identified former operators in photographs and corrected dates that official records had missed. Mayor Helen Dawson secured temporary funds to stabilize the leaking roof and protect the archive from moisture. Volunteers repaired the front steps, cleaned windows, and polished the switchboard fittings. Former residents arrived, carrying memories of voices they had never seen. One woman remembered an operator staying on the line during a childhood thunderstorm. An elderly man brought a photograph of his mother wearing a headset at the second station. Each story answered something while raising another question about how much of Bellwether's history had existed only in conversations no public record preserved. News of the diaries spread, but Maggie refused requests for sensational details. She explained that the collection mattered because the operators protected ordinary people, not because they exposed them. The exchange began to look alive again. Light reached the oak floors. Tools replaced debris. The old station stood clean beneath the clocks, ready to become evidence of work history had nearly ignored. Late one evening, Maggie returned alone to Clara's archive beneath the floor. She placed Diary 12 beside the transfer ledger and noticed a sealed letter resting behind the wooden file box.
It was thicker than the message found in the switchboard and addressed simply, "To Maggie, after every other voice has been heard." Beneath the words, Clara had drawn the symbol of the final operator station.
Maggie carried the letter upstairs where Eleanor and Daniel waited in silence. Then she broke Clara's seal and unfolded the final page. Clara's final letter began with a sentence Maggie had not expected. "You were chosen long before you knew there was anything to inherit." She stood at the oak counter beneath the restored pendant lights, the paper trembling slightly between her hands. Eleanor sat at the last operator station, while Daniel remained beside the open archive ledger. Outside, evening settled across Bellwether Square, and the exchange seemed to hold its breath. Clara wrote that she had followed Maggie's career through Christmas calls, brief visits, and stories passed between relatives. She knew Maggie had spent 30 years working in telecommunications, but that was not why she had chosen her. What mattered was how Maggie spoke about the people behind the calls. Clara remembered hearing about an elderly widower who phoned every month with the same billing question because he missed having someone answer. She remembered Maggie describing a frightened mother whose anger disappeared once someone listened long enough to understand that her service had been disconnected during a medical emergency. Clara had noticed that Maggie never boasted about solving problems. She spoke instead about the moment a caller's voice changed from fear to relief. "Machines can route a connection," Clara had written. "They cannot decide when a person needs patience more than speed." You learn to hear that difference. Maggie stopped reading and pressed her fingers against her mouth. She remembered those conversations with Clara. Though she had never considered them important, Clara had always asked unusual questions, not whether Maggie had received a promotion, but whether anyone had needed kindness that week, not whether the company was growing, but whether customers still reached a human being when they were afraid. Maggie had assumed the questions came from nostalgia. Now she understood Clara had been listening for evidence. "She was testing me," Maggie said. Eleanor shook her head gently. "She was recognizing you." The letter continued. Clara admitted that she had nearly sold the exchange more than once. Repair bills had drained her savings. Developers offered sums large enough to secure her final years. Each time, she sat at the final operator station and thought of Rose Mercer, who had accepted blame so the exchange could survive. Clara could not exchange that sacrifice for convenience. Yet she also knew preservation could become another form of abandonment. "A locked building," she wrote, "is only a quieter kind of forgetting." The diaries needed more than protection. They needed context, restraint, and someone capable of understanding that truth did not give a person permission to expose every private wound. Clara believed Maggie had learned that lesson over thousands of calls. "I did not leave you a building," the letter said. "I left you a responsibility. Make the past useful without turning it into spectacle. Let people understand that every connection began with someone willing to listen." Maggie lowered the page. The words reached the place inside her that had remained raw since the Tuesday she lost her job. She had believed the company's decision proved that her years of patience no longer mattered. Clara's letter offered a different judgment. The work had mattered even when the company failed to value it. Her experience had not become obsolete merely because someone younger occupied her desk. Daniel touched the edge of the counter. "This was never accidental," he said. "No," Maggie answered. "She chose me before she died." Eleanor looked toward Clara's photograph. Long before, at the bottom of the letter, Clara gave one final direction. The diaries should remain together. Sensitive names should remain protected. Rose's story should be told as an act of service, not a scandal. The exchange should become a place where Bellwether could remember the women who had connected its first emergencies, celebrations, losses, and ordinary days. Clara did not demand that Maggie keep the property. She asked only that Maggie decide after hearing every voice.
Maggie folded the letter carefully. "I've decided," she said.
The following morning, she met Mayor Helen Dawson, Daniel, Eleanor, former telephone workers, teachers, and volunteers inside the operator's room. The switchboards had been cleaned, but the cracks in the ceiling and the smell of old plaster reminded everyone how much work remained.
Maggie stood beside Clara's photograph and described her plan.
The exchange would become a small museum and oral history center. Visitors would see the original equipment, routing charts, storm records, and selected diary passages. Families could record memories of operators, callers, and community events. Private details would remain private. The purpose would not be to romanticize outdated technology, but to preserve the human labor hidden behind it. Daniel added that the building could be stabilized without removing its original character. Mayor Dawson confirmed the town would support a historical designation application and seek preservation funding. Eleanor volunteered to identify every operator she could remember. The room filled with practical questions about insurance, repairs, display cases, and archive conditions. Maggie answered what she could and wrote down the rest. For the first time since her dismissal, responsibility did not feel like a burden assigned by someone else. It felt chosen. During the next several days, preparation moved quickly. Daniel marked safe visitor routes and supervised temporary roof repairs. Volunteers built display frames from salvaged wood. Eleanor labeled photographs with exact names and dates, correcting anyone who confused one operator with another. Mayor Dawson arranged for copies of county storm records to be displayed beside Diary 12. Maggie selected passages that showed compassion without revealing identities. Grace called after hearing about the project and offered early customer service manuals from the regional office. Maggie accepted. She wanted the exhibition to show continuity between generations, not a false battle between old and new. Grace promised to attend the opening. On the evening before the first public reading, Maggie practiced alone beneath the switchboard clock. She read Clara's words aloud, then Rose's account of the storm, then a short entry about an operator who stayed with a lonely widower until dawn. Eleanor listened from the rear row. Daniel adjusted a display near the entrance. When Maggie finished, Eleanor said, "You understand where to pause." Maggie smiled. 30 years of listening.
She began returning the diaries to their case. The chief operator's transfer ledger lay beneath them. Opening it to Clara's signature, Maggie noticed faint pressure marks on the final blank page. Daniel brought a lamp closer. Maggie placed a sheet of thin paper over the indentations and shaded lightly with a pencil. Words emerged in Clara's hand. The next keeper must write not what she received, but why she chose to remain. Beneath the sentence was a space for a signature. Maggie turned to the final diary. Its last page was blank, waiting for her. The final diary rested open on the oak counter beneath the restored pendant lights. Every earlier volume had ended with a signature from an operator who believed her work belonged to the next generation as much as to her own. The last page remained blank, except for the faint line Clara had left for the next keeper. Maggie picked up the fountain pen that had been stored inside the archive desk for decades. She hesitated only a moment before writing the date. Then she began. I did not answer calls from this switchboard. I answered them through cables and computers many years later. I believed my career ended when I was told experience no longer mattered. I was wrong. The women whose names fill these pages taught me that listening has never depended on technology. It has always depended on choosing to remain when someone else needs to be heard. She paused, looking toward Clara's photograph, then continued. This exchange was preserved not because it contained perfect people, but because it contained ordinary people who accepted extraordinary responsibility without expecting recognition. Their greatest work cannot be measured by the calls they connected, only by the lives that quietly continued afterward. Maggie signed her name beneath Clara's final instruction, then closed the diary gently. The collection was complete. Eleanor wiped a tear from the corner of her eye without trying to hide it. Now it belongs to every keeper who comes after you, she said softly. The following Saturday, sunlight filled the operator's room through windows that had been cleaned for the first time in years. Fresh flowers stood beside Clara's photograph, replacing the faded bouquet Maggie had seen on her first visit. The restored switchboards gleamed beneath carefully polished brass fittings. Display cases held routing charts, operator headsets, emergency manuals, photographs, and selected diary passages that revealed compassion without exposing private pain. Along one wall, Daniel had installed a simple sign: Bellwether Telephone Exchange Museum and Oral History Center. Volunteers welcomed visitors through the front door. Families wandered slowly from display to display. Children asked why every telephone required an operator. Grandparents smiled as they explained party lines, handwritten directories, and the familiar voice that once answered every local call. Former residents pointed to photographs and recognized faces they had not seen in decades. Some laughed quietly. Others stood in thoughtful silence. Mayor Helen Dawson opened the ceremony with a brief welcome, thanking everyone who had contributed labor, photographs, documents, and memories. She admitted the town had nearly allowed the building to disappear because its value could not easily be measured. History is often preserved by people who receive no applause, she said. Today we correct one small part of that. She invited Maggie forward. Maggie stood beside the final operator station with the diaries resting on the counter behind her. She looked across the room and recognized Eleanor, Daniel, Grace, the retired electrician, former operators, school children, neighbors, and strangers who had traveled simply because they had heard an old telephone exchange was opening again. A few weeks earlier, she would have searched for the right speech. Instead, she unfolded Clara's final letter and read only one sentence. Let people understand that every connection began with someone willing to listen. She lowered the page and spoke in her own words. She explained that the women who worked inside the exchange rarely appeared in official reports because their success was measured by disasters prevented rather than attention received. They remembered frightened voices, lonely callers, missing children, isolated farms, elderly neighbors, and ordinary people whose lives briefly depended upon someone staying on the line. She spoke about Rose Mercer, who had accepted misunderstanding to protect families during the ice storm. She spoke about Clara, who spent decades preserving records she believed belonged to the community rather than herself. Finally, she spoke about listening. The equipment around us became outdated, Maggie said. The need to hear another person never did. Technology changes. Compassion still requires someone to choose it. The room remained silent for several seconds after she finished. Then applause spread slowly until it filled the exchange. Grace waited until the crowd began moving again before approaching. She looked around the room with quiet admiration. I wish everyone at the office could see this, she said. Maggie smiled. Maybe someday they will. Grace hesitated. I've been trying something. What? When customers call upset, I stop looking at the timer first. Maggie laughed softly. Does it help? More than I expected. Maggie nodded. Keep doing it.
Daniel joined them carrying a framed photograph of the 12 operators, now restored and mounted near the entrance. Visitors paused before it almost immediately. Eleanor wheeled herself closer and pointed from one face to another, telling stories she had carried for decades. No microphones were needed. People leaned closer because they wanted to hear. Throughout the afternoon, residents donated old telephone bills, switchboard tools, family photographs, and handwritten memories. A retired lineman offered his service notebooks. A woman in her 70s produced a faded letter thanking an operator who had remained on the line while her father suffered a heart attack years earlier. Maggie accepted each item carefully, explaining how it would be cataloged and preserved. The museum had already become what Clara hoped it would be. Not a room filled with relics, but a place where forgotten voices continued finding one another. Late in the day, after the final visitors departed, the exchange grew quiet again. Sunlight stretched across the polished floor as Eleanor prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, she stopped beside Maggie. "Clara was right," she said. "About what?" "She said you wouldn't keep this building because it belonged to your family." Eleanor smiled gently. "You'd keep it because it reminded you who you already were." After Eleanor left, Daniel locked the front door. "Ready?" he asked. Maggie looked around the operator's room one last time. The chairs were neatly arranged. The diaries rested safely inside their climate-controlled cabinet. Clara's photograph overlooked the switchboard exactly as it had overlooked generations of operators before her. Nothing about the room felt abandoned anymore. Almost. Maggie said. She crossed to the diary cabinet, opened the final volume one last time, and reread the page she had written that morning. Then she closed the leather cover, returned it to its place beside the others, and locked the cabinet with Clara's brass key. As she switched off the lights, she finally understood the note that had puzzled her from the very beginning. "Don't sell this place until you've heard every voice," had never meant searching for hidden recordings or forgotten conversations. It meant listening to every life quietly changed inside those walls before deciding what the building was truly worth. Maggie smiled, turned the key in the front door, and welcomed another day knowing she was no longer defined by the job she had lost, but by the legacy she had chosen to preserve, ensuring that the women who had connected generations of strangers would never again be forgotten. As Maggie locked the doors of the old telephone exchange for the evening, she realized that the greatest inheritance in life is rarely measured in money or property. It is measured in the quiet acts of kindness that continue long after our names have been forgotten. The women who once sat behind those switchboards never sought recognition. They simply listened when someone needed to be heard, helped when no one was watching, and trusted that compassion was worth more than applause. Their story reminds us that progress should never come at the cost of our humanity, and that every voice, no matter how ordinary it may seem, deserves patience, dignity, and care. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy any of us can leave behind is not what we own, but how deeply we listen, how willingly we help, and how faithfully we choose to be there for another person when it matters most.